Buonasera, vi do il benvenuto qui al Palazzo Geremia per una lezione che sicuramente sarà molto interessante. Parleremo non della caduta delle idee ma della caduta delle ambizioni e innanzitutto do il benvenuto alla professoressa Ghazala AZMAT. Buonasera. Lei insegna a Parigi, a Sciences Po, è professore di economia e prima di questo insegnava economia in Inghilterra, a Londra, al Queen Mary University e anche a Barcellona, all'Università Pompei Fabra. Nel 2006 ha preso il PhD alla London School of Economics e prima ancora il master all'University College, sempre a Londra, dove ha fatto anche i primi esami, poi sempre alla London School of Economics. Nel 2005, mentre stava preparando il dottorato di ricerca, è stato anche un anno a Firenze, all'Università Europea. Il suo campo di ricerche sono l'economia dell'istruzione, l'economia del lavoro e l'economia pubblica. La lista delle sue pubblicazioni è lunghissima, tutte su riviste internazionali, in più è coeditrice della rivista Labour Economics e collabora nella redazione di altre riviste. E oltre alla vita accademica ha svolto anche il ruolo di consulente di politica in Inghilterra e anche in Francia. A Londra ha lavorato per la Camera dei Deputati nel campo di gender equality e a Parigi con un comitato del Ministro dell'Educazione. Quindi è un curriculum molto ricco. E questa sera, questo pomeriggio, la professoressa Asma ci parlerà delle sue ricerche più recenti, le ambizioni per la propria educazione e carriera delle singole persone. Lei ci spiegherà che influenza ha il contesto politico e economico sulle scelte e sulle ambizioni personali. Queste decisioni fondamentali sono prese generalmente nell'ambito di norme, regole, valori e opinioni sul mondo dei ben definiti. E queste ricerche hanno a che fare con il mio paese, la Germania. Io sono la corrispondente del quotidiano economico per l'Italia. La professoressa AZMAT ha preso come oggetto e periodo dei suoi studi il caso della riunificazione tedesca, ma non solo. Ve la ricordo un attimo. Quest'anno sono 30 anni dalla caduta del muro. La sera del 9 novembre del 1989 veniva abbattuto questo simbolo della guerra fredda, questa cortina di ferro tra la mia Repubblica federale e la Repubblica democratica tedesca, la DDR. Da settimane prima di questo evento erano state manifestazioni, cortei, soprattutto a Lipsia. Forse qualcuno ricorda, dove lo slogan era «Noi siamo il popolo». E noi dell'Ovest a quell'epoca lo seguivamo con stupore e mi ricordo che tutti erano molto preoccupati e temevano una reazione violenta dalle forze dell'ordine della DDR. In quel 9 novembre di 30 anni fa tutto iniziò con una famosissima conferenza stampa dell'allora ministro della propaganda della DDR, Günther Schabowski. Era un corrispondente italiano che gli chiedeva su quando ci sarebbero stati concessi permessi di viaggio ai tedeschi dell'Est. E lui esitava un po', poi diceva ab sofort, quindi da subito, con effetto immediato. E i berlinesi, nel momento stesso, i berlinesi della parte est della città, accorrevano subito al muro, presero alla lettera il suo da subito. E per fortuna tutto andò bene. Le guardie, lasciati senza ordine, aprivano i varchi. Dopo 28 anni il paese non era più diviso. Poi, l'anno dopo, nel 1990, ci furono a marzo le prime elezioni e poi il 3 ottobre, che è la nostra festa nazionale, la riunificazione. Le foto delle persone con le bandiere seduti sui resti del muro sono un po' nella memoria collettiva, non solo nostra. Ma in verità non era esattamente una riunificazione tra due stati tedeschi, ma un'annessione da parte della Germania federale dei 5 nuovi Länder, cioè regioni della Germania Est e di Berlino Est. E questo è stato fatto, era necessario per non scrivere una nuova Costituzione. sottoscrivere nuovi trattati internazionali. E qui veniamo alla lezione della professoressa. Lei ha cercato di capire in che modo questa convergenza con la Repubblica Federale, cioè la Germania dell'Ovest, ha influenzato le aspirazioni e gli investimenti in formazione degli studenti dell'Est. Ha fatto le ricerche empiriche insieme alla sua collega Katja Kaufmann, che è professoressa all'Università di Mannheim, uno dei migliori atenei di economia in Germania. E quindi che significato ha avuto la riunificazione sulle scelte degli studenti? Positivo o negativo? Io vorrei solo, prima che cominciamo con la lezione, ricordare che per gli abitanti della Germania dell'Est questo periodo è stato vissuto come un profondo cambiamento, quasi traumatico. Dovevano recuperare molte cose, i vestiti, i jeans, il cibo, il pensiero libero, la multiculturalità. Molti sono venuti a vivere, a lavorare all'Ovest, ma tanti sono anche tornati perché non ce l'hanno fatto. Allora, che cosa ha scoperto sull'ambizione dei studenti? Prego.
Well, thank you very much, Regina, for this very nice introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about aspirations, the goals of the young. I'm going to be talking about what shapes them, and also what role society or our political environment plays in shaping and forming those aspirations. And of course, what impacts these then have in the longer run. But before I do that, let me not go into the details and start with something very broad and then later zoom in. So something which has been at the center of political policy and also academic debate in the last decades has been the existence and the persistence of gaps between groups of people. So whether this is looking at gender or race or ethnicity, we see that these gaps are there and persistent. If you start to look across the income distribution and you start to compare across different socioeconomic groups, there we also see not only are there these gaps in income and in labor market outcomes, but these are gaps which are getting bigger. And relatedly, when you look at intergenerational mobility, this is something that has either been constant over time in many countries, or in fact is something which is even decreasing. Now, this is all very puzzling, because there's a huge amount of effort that's gone into trying to achieve equality. So let's take an example. 1968 in the US, just after the Civil Rights Act is passed, you find that the median family income of an African American family is 57% that of white. Fast forward 50 years, and what you find is that after 50 years of anti-discrimination legislation, attempts to equalize across things like access to education, we still see the same gap. And so you can see here over time, this has been something which has been relatively flat. Now, similarly, when we think about gender equality, gender gaps in pay, well, this too is something that if you think about the amount of progress, so gender equality has been and continues to be one of the most important global objectives of recent times. And despite this, we continue to see important gaps in the labor market, especially in things like income and even participation. So then you start to go towards asking, well, what is it that explains these gaps? And as economists, traditionally we've argued that actually a large part of these gaps, we can explain them with supply-side choices. In other words, the choices that individuals make. So whether this be the educational choices we make, the occupational choices, whether we choose to have children, where we reside, these can explain a large part of these gaps. And the unexplained part, we can assign them, the residual part, to demand-side explanation. So this could be things like discrimination. Now, there's something important missing in all of this, and that's that the choices that we see being important in what we eventually find in the labor market have a root which is much less well understood. In other words, it's quite likely that the choices we see, they're not truly reflecting desire or someone's aspirations. They may well be actually somewhat constrained, perhaps even by the demand side. So we make certain choices with the consideration of what the demand side expects. So this, in a sense, if we want to go further in trying to understand where these gaps in income and these gaps across individuals come from, we need to, in a sense, think more about this constrained decision making. In other words, what is it that individuals actually aspire towards? What holds them back? Why are there sort of consistencies across certain groups of individuals? Now, I think before going any further, one thing that I should do is actually define what I mean by aspirations. And I think we can think of aspirations as being the desire to reach an attainable goal. Now, that's to say that quite likely the aspirations that individuals have, they're going to be grounded on some sort of preference. So for instance, I liked economics when I was at school more than I liked history, and therefore it's something I decided to pursue. But it's also likely to be somewhat grounded on our expectations as well. In other words, I never aspired to being an astronaut because I thought most likely I'm not going to make it. And also, I mean, within these sorts of preferences and expectations, we have this goal-setting behavior, and this may be something which is different across individuals. In other words, you make a bet against yourself. And to achieve this bet, to win this bet, you may put in a certain amount of effort. Now, these aspirations that we have, it's quite unlikely that they're going to be falling from the sky. Most likely they are grounded on some things. So they may be grounded on how we perceive ourselves, our self-assessment, the costs, the benefits involved in trying to go and get those goals and achieve them. But they're also likely to be grounded on our environment as well. So the perceptions of others are likely to be as important, perhaps, than the perceptions of ourselves. So what I've been doing is I've been looking at these aspirations in a number of ways. So I've been looking at aspirations at the individual level, simply looking to see whether aspirations can explain things, whether they are important in us reaching certain positions, reaching our goals. Then I look at this more broadly, so society's role and how this may be playing a part in our aspiration formation. And then finally, how these aspirations can be, if they can be changed. And in a sense, I think this is very relevant, especially from the point of view of policy. Because if these are aspirations that can be altered in some ways, it sort of calls for some type of policy intervention here. So for today's talk, I will be talking about each of these different aspects, and I will provide empirical economic evidence for these different parts. So let me start by talking about some work in which I've been looking at individual aspirations and the links with outcomes. So this has been a focus of some recent works. I work quite a lot on gender-related inequalities. And in this paper, in a project in which we're looking at aspirations, we ask two main questions. So we ask, do early career aspirations play a role in your later outcomes? And also, does it help to explain gender gaps in top positions? Now, this is something very important in the sense that we are seeing more and more gender equality in educational outcomes. In fact, actually, now you see that the college attendance rate, the university participation rate is actually higher amongst women than it is amongst men. But we continue to see these big, persistent gaps in the labor market. And so it's somewhat puzzling why we have these sorts of glass ceiling effects in the labor market. And so in this paper, we look at these two questions in the context of the legal profession in the US. Now, a little bit of background on that. So the legal profession in the US is one that has been expanding quite a lot, and it expanded quite sizably in the 1980s. And in its expansion, it actually attracted a lot of women into the profession. So for instance, in 1980, you had around 22% of the profession comprising of women, whereas today you have that almost 50% of law school graduates are women. Now, despite the sorts of changes within with respect to entry into the profession, we find that there are actually still growing concerns about earning differences, as well as promotion gaps among women in the profession. So here, just looking at the median weekly earnings of women and men over the last 20 years, what you can see is that while there's been this slow increase in earning for both men and women over time, there is a gap which has been persistent. And this is the case even among women who are entering into the profession, where there is gender equality in terms of the cohort of women who are entering into the profession. Now, what's interesting with all of this is that when you look at the differences between men and women in terms of their education, well, here, I mean, we are looking at one specific profession. So we're looking at women in the legal profession, men and women in the legal profession. So it's homogeneous in terms of it being a high-skilled profession. So levels of education are the same. But even beyond that, I mean, if you look at the types of law schools that men and women go to, there you have very similar sort of you see that they're going to very similar schools, so in terms of the ranking of the schools that they go to. In terms of their GPAs, in terms of their performance in law school, again, very similar across men and women. There doesn't seem to be any strong gaps. Even when you see the sort of decisions they make early on in terms of where to go and work, again, very similar between men and women. There doesn't seem to be strong differences. But then, as you look, even early on in their career as lawyers, earning gaps start to develop over time. And further down the line, these earning gaps are also then reflected in promotion gaps. Now, we're focusing actually on promotion per se, and I think it's important because promotion is something which, of course, is linked to wages. It's the two things. Often a promotion comes with some sort of pay increase. But promotion actually reflects lots of other things. It reflects power, it reflects prestige, it reflects a lot of responsibility that you may have in the profession, in the firm itself. And of course it is related to the gender pay gap as well. Now, when you look at the legal ladder, the legal promotion ladder, here are the numbers in terms of what goes on along this, in this progression. So at law school level, you see parity now. So 50% of women, 50% of men. In terms of law school completion, there's a dropout rate of around 10%. But even that, it's very similar across men and women. Now, going into the profession and deciding where you want to work once you have your law school degree, once you have your you've completed law school, there you see that around 65% of people decide to go into private law firms. And once they're in private law firms, they tend to be on this trajectory, on this track, in which they look to see if they can make partner within the firm eventually. So here you see some small differences between men and women. So 55% of men relative to 45% of women. But even so, again, quite close. But where the sort of striking difference comes is when you look at the top. So around 10 years after being in, entering into the profession, you can start to see the sort of promotion. And there you see that at the partner level, you have that. While the chance of making partner for men and women, so making partner is around 50%, there is quite a big difference between men and women. So while 80% of partners are men, only 20% of those partners are women. So we actually look at this and we follow we track a sample of lawyers. They are nationally representative graduates from law school in 2000. And they're tracked several times over 10 years. And they're asked about a number of things, including then being asked about what are your aspirations to making partner. So they're asked on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you aspire to making partner? And what you find is, again, and this is relatively early in their career, and what you find is that even early in their career, there are sizable gender differences. So around 30% of women have a low aspiration to making partner, compared with only about 12% of men. Looking at the top of career aspirations, you can see that, again, around 30% of women aspire to make partner, compared with 60% of men. So these are sizable differences. Now, you may then ask, well, does this matter? What you aspire at the beginning, does it have any relevance for later on? And the answer is yes, because early aspirations are very, very strongly linked to what happens later on. So those who have low aspirations are less than 20% likely to make partner, and those who have high aspirations are 60% likely to make partner. And beyond this, when we look to see the importance of this in explaining gender promotion gaps, what we find is that these early career aspiration differences explain 50% of the promotion difference that you see between men and women. So just to sort of give you a summary of the main sort of findings that we have from the study. Well, first of all, we show that despite there being very similar sort of starting points for men and women in the profession, these gaps start to develop relatively early on once they're within the profession. So aspirational gaps build up. These promotion trajectories are also different for men and women. And these aspiration gaps are explaining a large part of these differences that we later see in promotion. Now, beyond doing this, another thing that we do in the paper is we try to understand where these gaps are coming from. So we try to understand how much of this is to do with a preference or desire, how much of it is to do with your perceived probabilities about whether you're going to make it as partner or not. And we also look to see whether it's the case that these these aspirations can be changed in any way. And what we find actually is that there is a important component in terms of how their work environment can impact aspirations. So, for instance, one of the aspects that we looked at is very early on in their career, they asked about whether, on the basis of their gender, they experienced any sort of demeaning remarks, discriminatory comments on the basis of their gender. And what you find is that while 25% of women say that they experience these types of remarks, only 6% of men do. And more importantly, these differences, these experiences in the workplace, then actually go on to impact aspirations. And they're an important contributor to why some women may have lower aspirations than other women within the profession. So it's a basis for that. And I think, in a sense, what this kind of tells us is that aspirations can be somewhat shaped by our environment. And here we're seeing that our work environment is playing an important role. But it then begs the question that, well, this may actually be, it may be the case that your environment more generally, that your society or your political environment can also be playing an important role. And I think this then naturally takes me to the second part of my talk. And this is looking at this broader implication, looking at society's role in changing aspirations. So this is the basis of some work I'm doing, which Regina touched upon at the beginning. And here we're asking three main questions. We're asking, do political regimes shape our goals and our aspirations? Can the environment also impact our attitude? And also, whether these changes in your aspirations and attitudes then feed back into our outcomes later on. Now, for this paper, unlike the paper on the lawyers, we're not focusing on young professionals, we're actually focusing on children. We're looking at adolescents. And I think, in a sense, looking at children seems quite relevant, since shaping the aspirations at a very young age seems to be something that's quite relevant for longer term outcomes. Now, the motivation for this project actually is that when you think about how aspirations may form, your individual aspirations, it's quite likely that they're not done in some sort of vacuum. They're not done in isolation. These aspirations are quite likely to be formed in a way which is in a context, such as your community, your society, the political environment that you have, worldviews. Now, but little is actually known about what these influences are or what impacts that they can have, despite the fact that they will have potentially long-run implications. Now, one of the reasons why it's difficult to look at this is because it's very challenging to actually separate what one's individual aspirations are from that of those around them. So we often will be within our community, within our environment, and it's very difficult to separate which part is coming from which part. But it's the objective of our paper, and it's something that we're able to do given our context. So we are able to causally look at changes in one's socio-economic environment and see how this affects individual aspirations, and also to see if this then has any longer run impacts. And we're focusing here in the domain of education. Now, the second objective is to then delve into the mechanism. So try to understand if aspirations are changing, what is it that is impacting those aspirations? And here we turn to a very classic education model, which says that there tend to be three important components in determining our choice of education. The first is that we choose education on the basis of what we expect to get out of it, in terms of the returns, in terms of our earnings. So the expected returns to education from our degree, for example. The perceived uncertainty of this decision. So how uncertain is it if I make this choice in education for my later result, my later outcome? And also your preferences. So this could be your consumption preferences, could be something which is then driving your decision about how much education to have. So the setting that we use is a very sort of, it's an important setting, and this is the German Reunification, which took place in October 1990. And it's one of the most important structural, political changes that we've seen in recent history. And this is because we see a convergence of East Germany to West Germany. Now, just to give a little recap, I think Regina talked about this very nicely, but let me talk a bit about the context. So until the end... Oh. Thank you. So the window. I think this is another fall of the wall. Okay, let me stand it. It's not closing. That was planned. So until the end of World War II, Germany was a single country. After the Second World War, it was split between the Soviets, where you see East Germany, and the West under the US, France, and the UK. So in 1949, soon... Okay, and in 1949, a border is formed between East Germany and West Germany, and eventually, in the early 60s, you see the sort of the Berlin Wall being erected. And in a sense, this is a very symbolic change, because it represents, in a sense, this change, this division between the East and West that has been there actually even for some time. But what's kind of important within all of this is that East Germany developed under a communist regime. Now, it wasn't obvious to everyone that this, 40 years down the line, that this wall was actually going to disappear at some point. So you have this quote from the head of the GDR in January 1989, in which he says that this wall will be standing in 50 or even 100 years. Now, we know with this historic moment in November 1989, in which there was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in a sense, this fall then led to a chain of events following it. Now, it's not the first wall that we've seen in history. There have been other walls, like the Hadrian Wall, the Great Wall of China. Unfortunately, it may not even be the last wall that we're going to see in history. So there may be more to come. But going back to Germany, so the convergence to the West. Now, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, we see that Germany reunified. And I think this was very special because while the Iron Curtain was rising over in many countries, while many countries were actually forming countries of their own, here what you have is that East Germany decided that there would be this reunification with the West. And not only a reunification, but a convergence to the political and the economic system of the West. Now, in terms of education, so what was going on with education between the East and the West over this time? Well, actually, access to go into higher education was actually very similar in the East and West. So there was the way in which an individual would go to university would be by completing the Abitur. And this is a 2-year secondary school certificate which would give you access to university. And this was the case before and after reunification, and it was the same in the East and in the West. But where there were big differences were in things like university participation. So while 40% of students in the West were going to university, only 20% of students in the East were going to university. Now, the other major difference was in terms of the returns to university. So for someone who went to university in the East, they could expect an average sort of increase in their income relative to someone who didn't go to university or someone who was a blue-collar worker by around 15%, compared with someone who was in the West, where the increase there was 70%. So a much bigger returns to education, a return to your college education than what it was or in the East. So let me tell you a little about our study. The data that we're using is that we're looking at, we're following 2 distinct cohorts of students who are 3 years apart in age, and they're surveyed over several years, before and after reunification. And the older cohort, who are 3 years older, you first see them when they're in grade 6, and the younger cohort, you see them when they're in grade 3, so 12 years old and 9 years old. Now, the variables that we're interested in looking at are, first of all, that the students are asked repeatedly over the years how much they aspire, whether they aspire to going to university. In other words, to attain the Abitur. And then we're looking at some other important variables. So we're looking at the actual outcome, so whether these guys actually do go to university or not. And then there are other sorts of dimensions that we focus on, like their socioeconomic preferences and also their psychological well-being. And I'll come to this a little later. But what's important is the timing. So they're asked about this over time, including in this small interval just before and just after reunification. Now, in terms of measuring the effect of reunification on aspirations, what we do is we analyze the effect that this has on the younger cohort, the younger cohort within our sample. And we compare them to the older cohort at the same grade. Now, why do we do that? Well, that's because what the older cohort allows us to do is it allows us to use them as a counterfactual trend. In other words, it tells us what would have happened in terms of their educational aspirations and outcomes had reunification not happened. So to be a little bit more precise on this is kind of how the timeline looked for the two cohorts. So reunification happened in 1990 when the younger cohorts were in grade 8 and the older cohorts were in year 11. Now, we're not looking and comparing the grade 8s with the grade 11s. Instead, what we're doing is we're comparing the grade 8s from the younger cohort with the older cohort when they were in grade 8. And why this is important is because when the older cohort were in grade 8, it was 1988, they were 14 years old, and it was pre-unification. The younger cohort, when they were in grade 8, also 14 years old, it's 1991, and this is post-reunification. But we can still use these similarities in their age and their grade to see what the effect of reunification has been. On top of that, we're looking at this very narrow interval. So we're comparing them just before and just after reunification happens. So here we have our group, which is a younger cohort in which we're looking at the aspiration change. And the control group, where this is the older cohort, and they give us some idea of what would have happened had there not been reunification. And we use this difference in difference design. So just to give you an idea of what actually then happened, so here, this is the older cohort. So this is all pre-reunification time. And you can see that when they're asked, do you aspire to obtain the abitur, so to go to university? When they're in grade 6, there's around 40% of them who say that they do. But then you can see that this starts to fall, and by the time they're in year 9, this goes down to around 20%, so much lower. And you see that, in a sense, this is something that we do observe in general, that as children get older, their aspirations for whether they're going to go to university actually do start to decline. And this is because you get a better idea of yourself. You get a better idea perhaps through information on your grades, on whether university is well matched to you. So it's something that has been shown in other studies as well. But what's very interesting is if you then look at the younger cohort, and you can see that in the pre-reunification period, also they're following this sort of downward trend in terms of their aspiration. But following reunification, when they're in year 8, there's this big jump up in terms of aspirations. And this, when you put the two things together, so comparing the older and the younger cohort at the same grade, there is a 57% difference. So 57% more students in the younger cohort are aspiring to do the abitur. So in the pre-reunification period, we see that there are no differences. In the post-reunification period, we see that there are these sizable differences. And these results are still there when we control for important individual specific characteristics, even information on their families, and these results are still kind of holding beyond that. So then the next thing to turn to is, well, what are the longer run impacts? Do these aspirations translate into anything? Does it have an impact in terms of when we see that this regime has changed, does it have an impact on what students actually do? Okay? And for this, what we can do is we can follow these individuals when they're 18 years old. So once they've made their decision about whether they're going to do the abitur and complete the abitur, using their aspirations earlier on. And for this, we have three main hypotheses. The first is that, very simply, that our hypothesis is that aspirations predict attainment. In other words, there is this link of what you kind of aspire very early on to what you actually do later. And that in grade 8, they're a better predictor than in grade 7, partly because you see that these aspirations are going down, so people in a sense are learning about themselves, they get closer to reality. Our second hypothesis is that the effect is stronger among the younger cohort, and this is because they experience reunification at this time when they're at a point in which they can make some changes. At this point, when you know, at the age of 18, it's a post-reunification period for even the older cohort. But we expect that these are stronger for the younger because they are able to they have more time to react to this. And then finally, the change that we see in aspirations by the age of by grade 8 among the younger cohorts is fully explaining any change in attainment that we see in terms of the difference between the two groups. And this is what we find. So we find that, yes, it's true, there is a very strong link. So if you have high aspirations, using your grade 7 aspirations, this has an impact. It has a 46 percentage point. You have a higher chance of achieving it. It's even stronger in using your grade 8 aspirations. On the second hypothesis, it also seems to be the case that more students in the younger cohort aspire, and more of them are obtaining the abitur. But it's relevant for both groups. So it's not just something that we're seeing among the younger cohort. And finally, this change in aspiration in year 8 is fully explaining this change in attainment that we see. So it's explaining all of the differences across the two groups of students. So that takes me then to this sort of final part. And here, what I've shown you so far is that very soon after reunification, educational aspirations increased, and they translated into higher educational attainment several years later. But then the question is then, why are these educational investments changing? And here, as I said at the start, we can think in a sense about what a standard education model would tell us. And it would tell us that there are 3 important driving forces. What we expect to actually earn once we complete our degree. So the expected returns to education, how much we expect to get for our studies. The second is the uncertainty around this decision, this educational decision. And also the economic or the consumption preferences that we have. And all 3 of these are going to drive our decision to enter into education and to continue into education. But this is often very challenging because it's very difficult to actually not only to measure each of these components, but to separately measure these components and to try and understand what it might be that's driving these educational attainment, but also these changes in response to changes in aspirations. So in order to shed light on the mechanism, what we are able to do is we are able to measure actually the youth's expected returns to education. And we also use their socio and economic preferences to give us a sense of what their consumption preferences may be. And also the psychological measures, which can act as a proxy, it can act as a way for us to measure how students feel with respect to things like uncertainty around potentially their decision. And then we link these 2 aspirational changes as well. So going on to the first point, we asked 2 questions. Firstly, do these adolescents respond to implied increases in your returns to university education? As I mentioned before, there were very big differences between the East and the West. So while the returns to education was only 15% in the East, it was 70% in the West. So a convergence, in a sense, implied that there would be these increases, these changes in your returns to education. And also then, does this explain why an individual might change their aspiration? Is it responsible for, if you have these implied increases, is it responsible for increasing your aspirations? So we do this by looking at the response of students to a question, again, that they're asked before and after reunification, both cohorts again, in which they're asked, what is the importance to study in school in order to earn more later? And they're asked this on a scale from 1 to 4. And what we find is that this following reunification goes up quite significantly. So it goes up by 0.5 standard deviations from the mean. From the second part, and I think this is interesting in itself, because the second part, we're trying to understand how and whether your economic and your social preferences are changing following this big political regime change that we see in Germany. And this is important because there's been a lot of work which has looked at the persistence of culture in our decisions. So here we want to understand if there is this cultural persistence, and also do people actually adapt to the new regime in terms of their preferences. So to look at the economic preferences, we have, again, similarly, the students are asked about how important it is for them as a goal to consume luxury goods, to enjoy life. They are also asked how important it is, this again is before and after, so we can understand that there may be some changes, for supporting socialism or the GDR. But also other things like which are more related to this feeling of being part of a collective or a society, and also the importance of doing good deeds. So, and these, in a sense, you can think that both with respect to the economic and the social preferences, the responses, if they're changing, it would be interesting to see if they're going in a direction where they're following more the new regime. So if they look a little bit more like the preferences that you see in the West. And this is something that we see. So both economic preferences following reunification, again, very soon after reunification, increase. So consuming luxury goods does become much more important than it was before. So does enjoying life. Political preferences here too, we see that the importance of supporting socialism goes down, and this you may imagine, but also other sorts of social preferences, such as being part of a collective or helping others more. Both of these are also going down too. In terms of linking them with changes in aspiration, well, it does seem to be the case that while all of these are relevant for changes in aspiration, it does seem that those who changed more their economic preferences, their expected return, the importance that they put on the importance that they put on school for their expected return, are also those who increase their aspirations much more. Similarly, those who were more inclined to reduce their support for socialism are also those who are more inclined to have a change in their aspiration. So you do see that there is this link between these changes in preferences, these changes in aspirations, which then eventually lead to changes in outcomes. And then for the final part, again, in itself, it's relatively interesting because here this is asking about sort of the uncertainty. And here we're looking at this via these psychological measures. And it's been shown in other sorts of, in other settings, and in particular in developing countries, where it's shown that one's internal constraints, so one's psychological constraints, can actually be an important sort of explanation for why we may see lower aspirations. So here we're asking the question whether it's the case that a change in the external environment can actually impact one's internal constraints as well. And again, whether these internal constraints are relevant or have an impact on educational aspirations as well. So without going into too many details, we do find that there is this difference. So we do see that changes in your external environment are relevant. So we have three distinct measures. So we have measures of their self-confidence, of their anger, and of their anxiety. And while before reunification, across the two different cohorts, you don't see any differences in these psychological measures and the well-being measures, following reunification, you do find that the level of anger goes up, the level of anxiety goes up, which is not surprising given that this was a momentous change, and the amount of self-confidence goes down. But linking this to aspirational changes, what we find is that those who became more angry are those who actually were the ones who increased their aspirations more. And similarly, those who became more self-confident, or at least were less inclined to reduce their self-confidence, are also the ones for who aspirations are increasing. So here, just summing up some of the lessons from this study. Firstly, that the aspirations among school-age children, adolescents, adapt relatively quickly to this societal change. It translates into an actual change in college attendance, so participation, entry later on. And it highlights this link between goal setting and the links that you make with your investment, the decisions that you're making. And I think here we're also shedding some light into the mechanism behind. So why is it that these changes are happening? So let me wrap up, and I think I want to sort of have two sort of main messages to take away from these various studies. And the first is that I think it's important to pay attention to the aspirations of the young. I think that the evidence that we're seeing is that aspirations are an important predictor of our future outcomes. So young, as in even young professionals, we see that your early career aspirations have impacts for your promotion later. But among school children as well, you're seeing that their aspirations are a good predictor for what they will do several years down the line. And so it suggests that the sort of motivation, the aspirations that you have, they drive the decisions that we take. And it's also driving, in a sense, the efforts that you will make to try to achieve these goals. And the other is that aspirations, they partly are reflecting your preference, and they're partly reflecting your expectation of what you can and can't achieve. But they are also something which can be shaped. So with the example of the lawyers, we can see that early work experiences are sort of explaining differences in aspirations, even among just women. When you look at education, you can also imagine that having interventions at an early stage can potentially help the aspirate or shape the aspirations of young children. And also then the political and social environment seems to be also reflecting one's aspirations, and we're seeing these sorts of longer run consequences as well. So then this, in a sense, this takes me to then my final words, which is that I think often when we look at the political landscape and the influences of educational and professional decisions, they seem to be relevant, especially for the young. They seem to have long-standing implications with important consequences. But it's often not something that politics takes into account or policies take into account. That when we see, for instance, these changes in political regime across countries, often the focus is what's going on today. How does it affect workers today? How does it affect immigration policy? How does it affect firms? But a lot less attention is paid on how does this affect the younger individuals who are also experiencing these changes. And the issue is that not only is it not considered, it's also not incorporated, because we won't see the consequences of this for another 10, 15 years once these students are in the labor market. So this, in a sense, is something I think also then deserves a lot more attention. Okay, thank you.
Grazie tantissime Ghazala per questa lezione. Posso capire benissimo che ha scelto questo periodo veramente particolare nella storia europea, ma anche la prima parte mi è piaciuto molto sui studenti di leggi negli Stati Uniti. Io vorrei soltanto aggiungere che forse non abbiamo più talmente presente che prima della caduta del muro nella Repubblica dell'Est, nella DDR, non è che si potevano scegliere i studi, non era possibile, era abbastanza canalizzato, magari nelle scienze. Vi ricordo la nostra cancelliera Merkel che viene dall'Est, lei ha studiato fisica, che era più facile, ma altri temi non è che uno poteva scegliere liberamente la facoltà, bisogna anche tener conto di questo quando vediamo quello che è venuto fuori da questi studi. Io adesso voglio dare al pubblico la possibilità di fare delle domande. Ecco, abbiamo un microfono? Prego.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My question is related to one of the last slides we saw, and it's about the policy implication of these studies. What can be the policies that we can implement to create an environment in which the aspirations of young people can develop and can grow? What policies can change and shape? Maybe shape is a very strong word when we talk about aspirations. Of course, I guess that the unification of Germany was a very effective policy, but it's not a policy we have at our hand right now. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, actually, I mean, I think there's a number of ways in which this can be done. And there is some recent interesting work by Professor Liana Lafera from Bocconi and a group of researchers in which they are doing some interventions, especially among immigrant students in Italy, in which they are providing sort of motivational classes. They are giving them information about what they can do, what they can achieve. And here, this is one way in which you're intervening on aspirations. So this is just one example, and they're looking specifically at immigrant students, but we could imagine that you could do this for different groups. But this is one way in which you can intervene, and they are finding actually positive results in terms of educational attainment and also staying in education for longer.
Altre domande? Prego.
Thank you. Many times when we look at our miserable political situation here, we think that we should invest more into education, but your study seems to contradict this thing, because basically what you're saying is that politics has a short-term effect on the aspirations of young people, while education may have a longer, so an effect that is lasting longer in time. Can you comment on that? Is that correct?
No, I mean, what I would say is that there are externalities of the political regime that I think we're not taking into account. So I think, I mean, we don't tend to incorporate the fact that these sorts of, like the rise in populism, changes in the way politics is done, is having an impact to a greater extent than we potentially would have in mind. So these effects I think are not short-term at all. I think actually there are these longer-run implications, because the politics of today are not only affecting individuals who are within the labor market today, they're affecting people who are to come into the labor market eventually as well. Now, with respect to sort of spending in schools, again, I mean, this is an important and big area, and there's ways in which we could focus more specifically on things like aspirations or even sort of socio-behavioral attitudes, which are also then feeding into our aspirations. And I think, in a sense, if anything, this research is highlighting that that there are more aspects in which you can intervene rather than some traditional ways in which we have been intervening.
Grazie. Un'altra domanda? Prego.
Thank you, Professor. It's really nice that to meet you here because I've been reading your papers. So basically, recently I've read these set of papers which are saying that in academia, even if you have women in the hiring committees, still you don't have, there's no improvement, which makes my aspiration level quite low because I'm studying economics and we see all these problems in women in economics. So what do you have to say? Like, I want to know your comment on that, or how do you think that reforms could be brought about in academia? Thank you.
Yeah, this touches on a really important topic, and it's a topic which I'm interested in myself as well in terms of research. And you're right that the evidence in terms of these recent reforms that we've seen in terms of gender quotas on committees or boards, the results have been quite mixed, and in some cases actually been negative in terms of performance of firms. But I'm still hopeful, actually. I think that, because again, I think here there's a number of different angles that we can look at. So first of all, performance may not be the only measure of interest. There are other aspects in terms of, for example, how things are run, how things are done. And the other, and I think more important, is the longer run implications that these policies can have. So even if it's through something like a role model effect, while today we may not see the sort of the big gains in terms of productivity or performance, perhaps 15, 20 years down the line, we're going to see naturally gender parity, so we wouldn't need these types of policies. And that's the achievement. And it's, again, it's this idea that we're not internalizing some of these other types of potential effects. And then I think it could point to that there are other ways in which we can try to work on gender equality in the labor market. So we may need to find other routes to get to it. And I think some of the work that I presented today also kind of suggests that while you see that these aspiration gaps appear even among professional women in the legal sector, that these differences are partly explained by your environment. And actually, interestingly, even there, I mean, women who have the same levels of aspirations, so if they have high aspirations, their outcomes are very similar to men who have high aspirations. So they're as likely to make partner as a male lawyer who has high aspirations. The differences are there on average. And also, there doesn't seem to be in the workplace this sort of explicit discrimination of how you're rewarding performance. Again, for the same levels of performance, men and women are rewarded similarly. But where these gaps are coming from are potentially these experiences that you may have, and then your desire to want to stay within the profession or to progress in the profession as well.
Grazie. Era un'altra domanda qui? Sì, qui. E dopo
yeah, wanted to tap into your last comment. So going back to the study on lawyers, it seems, as you've said, that from an educational standpoint, the gap is fairly closer, although there is a lot of ground to cover there. But so my question is, should we maybe also tap into the aspiration of the more advantaged groups? So should we maybe, I think here, for example, about male overconfidence, teach males to be less overconfident?
It's interesting that you raised that, actually, because one, didn't talk about it here, but one of the aspects that we're looking at is we can look at the levels of satisfaction and regret among these lawyers over time. And actually what you find is that it's male lawyers who have higher levels of regret, especially if they don't make it as partner, which may suggest, I mean, I was talking about this idea of goal setting, like making a bet against yourself. And it may be that, I mean, that men have a too high goal, and then, I mean, it becomes more difficult to actually maintain and to reach and win this bet against yourself. So it could be true, and I think this comes through in the levels of satisfaction, your happiness, your feelings of regret. So this is very interesting, yeah.
Ecco un'altra domanda.
One of the things that often comes out in gender pay studies is that the gap really widens particularly when women have their first child. And do you see this also in the aspiration, particularly in your lawyers' study? So were the aspiration to have a family or not, is that important in whether people make partner and whether they want to make partner in the longer term?
Yeah, no, this is very important. So we do find actually with women in our sample that irrespective of whether they have kids or not, there are aspiration differences compared with men. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it does seem to be, this is also another decision you're making, and there you can imagine that you're probably taking this into account with respect to how the organization is structured. So even though we're not seeing evidence of sort of explicit discrimination within the firm, what you may see actually is that there are implicit institutional discrimination that comes about because this organization is not designed to accommodate for women who are with young children. And this is something that we see, especially in terms of things like performance. So one of the differences that we find, which is responsible for promotion differences later, is the number of hours that you bill to clients. So this is one of the performance measures. And there what you find is that there is a distinct difference between not just men and women, but women with young children compared with men with young children. So there you find that they're much less likely to have higher sort of hours billed. So it does seem to be something that's constraining in terms of their performance, which then does have important implications later for promotion.
Hi. Here. Okay. So thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting, and it's also interesting thinking about the literature on how expectations are formed. Usually, it's often it's related to how the individuals form their expectations, but it's interesting to incorporate also how the environment shapes them. So this is very interesting. And my questions with respect to the paper on the Berlin Wall is whether there were also changes in the educational system and institutional changes which drive your results, because it's a quite big effect. And with respect to the big effect, I would like also to know maybe if there are some heterogeneities in who are these people who actually changed their expectations in response to the to the Berlin Wall fall.
Yeah, so both of these things are important. So one of the reasons, so you're right, I mean, some things changed. In terms of the school structure, in the very short run, very little changed. Small differences, like, for example, they would have 2 hours of socialist teaching per week, and this then disappeared. But this is partly the reason why we're looking so narrowly around reunification, because in the short run, very little was changing within the schools, the same teachers, mostly the same subject, but and that's what kind of made it quite interesting, that very shortly after reunification, and knowing that there was going to be this convergence to the West, you see this sort of adaptation happening among the students in the East. For your second point, I mean, this is something I was kind of trying to get into with the mechanism about who is it that's changing, and this is what we were finding, that it's those who were updating the most in terms of the weight that they put on the importance of school, of education, for then later earning more in life. So those who updated the most were those who then increased their aspirations the most as well. And similarly, those who had stronger economic preferences, like for consumption, were also the ones who were updating. And social preferences as well, so those who were more inclined to sort of converge with this individualistic idea that is more represented in Western societies, were also those who increase their aspirations. So it's basically showing that those who were converging the most in terms of their preferences were also the ones who changed their aspirations and then went into university more as well.
For putting a question myself, I was very struck by the first part of your lecture from these lawyers, And do you know anything about similar studies in Europe? Are there differences between countries?
So I haven't seen studies which have looked at other countries. And I think part of the main reason we're focusing on the US is because the data that we have is coming from the American Bar Association, in which they're asked about all of these different sort of preferences and tracking them later on in life. In terms of how the systems work, I mean, I'm more familiar with the UK, and I imagine that it's not very different. There may be some differences. I think pay is probably not as high as it is in the US, but I think the way in which the system works, as in the track that you're on, in terms of going to law school, joining a private law firm, and then being on this track to make partner, this is something that you see in other countries as well. And I think this is the case in other European countries too.
Allora, ringrazio tantissimo la professoressa AZMAT per questi dati e le conclusioni che ci ha dato. Io vorrei aggiungere che secondo me dovrebbe assolutamente continuare su questo tipo di studi, non solo nella Germania di oggi, perché secondo me i risultati sarebbero completamente diversi, ma anche per tutti gli altri paesi in Europa e anche in Italia. Quindi un grande grazie. Mi sono dimenticata di dire che la professoressa è inglese e viene da Liverpool, e qui abbiamo una cosa comune: questa sera c'è la finalissima della Champions League e ci auguriamo la vittoria del Liverpool con il CD tedesco. Vi ringrazio.